On October 2nd, 2021, Brandon Brown won his first Xfinity Series NASCAR race. He was super excited. The NBC Sports reporter was interviewing him, and while she's conducting this interview, and he's talking about how amazing it is that he won this race, the massive crowd behind Brandon is chanting, and they're cheering something. At first, it's undecipherable what they're chanting, but it's loud, and so the producer seems to cut away to the crowd, and the sports reporter feels like she needs to try to explain what's happening, and so she thinks the crowd is chanting, "Let's go, Brandon." And so she announces that's what they're chanting, but the longer you listen, you realize that's not what they're chanting. They're chanting a swear word attached to then President Joe Biden's name. It's an expletive that I can't repeat here, but it's a very demeaning phrase. And so they're chanting this demeaning thing about then President Joe Biden. Well, political conservatives pick up on this, and they decide that "Let's go, Brandon" is a nice code word for being able to speak in a disparaging way about the President of the United States at the time, Joe Biden. And all of a sudden, "Let's go, Brandon" starts showing up in public spaces on the internet. People are printing up T-shirts and posters. And not just average people, but political leaders are using this phrase as a way of disparaging and demeaning the person who is serving as the President of the United States. Last week, we talked about the fact that our God is infinitely compassionate and merciful, that he chases after all people who are willing in any way to acknowledge him. Well, it might not surprise you that an infinitely compassionate God is not a fan of such demeaning language, that he's not a fan of speaking about anybody, let alone leaders, in such a demeaning, belittling, reviling sort of way. This morning, we're continuing our sermon series in the book of Ecclesiastes. And what we're wanting to do is, as the Lord is deconstructing the kind of worldview that we keep getting week after week in the society in which we live, he wants to reconstruct a way to live life that is full of health and blessing and grace. You see, one of the great tragedies, or the great tragedy of Matthew Perry's life, we talked about him last week, was the fact that after he experienced the grace of God as a prodigal son, he didn't choose to obey the Lord and to follow in the path that God laid out for him. And his life ended up as a terrible tragedy. Now you might think, yeah, we're talking about how we speak about other people and about leaders. That doesn't compare in a bad sort of way to being addicted to drugs or alcohol or sex or cigarettes like he was. But that's what all of us who are addicted to other things say. We want drugs and alcohol and sex to be the really bad things so that our things don't look that bad. But the truth of the matter is sin. And God gives us instructions about how to live our life in such a way. And if we follow those instructions, whether we think they're big or we think they're small, if we follow those instructions, there is life that direction. And if we don't, all that's waiting for us is death and difficulty and hardship. So this morning we want to take a Bible, if you have one, and turn to the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 10. We want to think together about what the Lord has to say about speaking about those in positions of leadership and power. Ecclesiastes 10, if you don't have a Bible, there's one in the rack in front of you. In those Bibles, it's page 546. 546, the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 10. We're going to be looking at verses 15 to 20. Page 546, as we continue to think together about how to construct or reconstruct a life that is pleasing to the Lord, that's not built on human wisdom, not built on the things going on in society and culture around us, but built on what God says in his word. Ecclesiastes 10, beginning in verse 15, page 546. The toil of fools wearies them. They do not know the way to town. Woe to the land whose king was a servant and whose princes feast in the morning. Blessed is the land whose king is of noble birth and whose princes eat at a proper time for strength and not for drunkenness. Through laziness the rafters sag, because of idle hands the house leaks. A feast is made for laughter, wine makes life merry, and money is the answer for everything. And then verse 20. Do not revile the king even in your thoughts, or curse the rich in your bedroom, because a bird in the sky may carry your words, and a bird on the wing may report what you say. Now, at first glance, these verses just appear to be kind of separate aphorisms, wisdom statements, kind of all stitched together and put here, sometimes like the way the book of Proverbs work. But it's interesting to me that of all the things that is said here, 3 of them have to do with the king, have to do with the idea of government leaders, those in positions of leadership and power. Verses 16 and 17, woe to the land whose king was a servant and whose princes feast in the morning. Blessed is the land whose king is of noble birth and whose princes eat at a proper time for strength and not for drunkenness. Verses 16 and 17 are laying out the very true fact that there are good leaders in this world and there are bad leaders in this world. Whether we're thinking locally or if we're thinking about our businesses or our schools, but especially when it comes to political power, local leaders, statewide leaders, countrywide leaders, national leaders, world leaders, there are good leaders and there are bad leaders. A country that has a good leader is blessed. A country that has a bad leader suffers. And verses 16 and 17 sort of portray this for us. Verse 16 says, the land whose king was a servant and whose princes feast in the morning. That's strange language to our ears. We don't really talk that way. But if you notice the word servant, it has a little superscripted A next to it. And if you look in the footnote, it says, or king is a child. That's because the Hebrew word that is translated as servant is more normally used for the word child. And the idea is that you can have people in positions of leadership who are childish in their moral maturity. They are like a young child. They're also childish in their abilities to administer. They don't have the skills and the necessary abilities to be a good leader. Such a person, we're told in verse 16, their princes feast in the morning. Again, strange language. It's just the language of instant gratification. That there are leaders who are doing things not at the proper time. They're doing them because they want them, and they want them to happen now, and this is in their best interest. That's a bad leader according to verse 16. It's a childish person, an immature person, a person who is acting morally and administratively like a child. Verse 17 says, but there are also good leaders in this world. And not just those who are Christians. There are good leaders in this world who do things in the right way, in a mature way, who wait until the proper time to do various things. And so verses 16 and 17 are establishing that in this world there are good leaders and bad leaders. The reason that's so important is we're going to focus on verse 20 and how we talk about those in leadership. But one of the rationalizations, one of the justifications that all of us give when we speak poorly about people in leadership is we say, but they're doing a bad job. But verses 16 and 17 acknowledge, yeah, there are bad leaders, but God still commands what he commands in verse 20, even though there are bad leaders. It's no excuse. Well, verse 20 is where we want to focus our time. Look at it. It is a command from God to us. Do not revile the king, even in your thoughts. Do not revile the king, even in your thoughts. Now, we got to be very careful that we don't misapply this passage. because there's lots of ways we can apply it to the wrong thing. This passage is not saying that you and I as Christians shouldn't discern when a decision by a leader is a bad decision. Verse 16 does that. They said their princes feast in the morning. Verse 16 is acknowledging that certain leaders make bad decisions. As Christians, we're supposed to discern those things. Verse 20 is not forbidding that in any way. Verse 20 is also not forbidding discerning and evaluating poor, childlike moral character in leaders. Verse 16 does that very thing. Verse 20 is not talking about looking at someone in a position of leadership and saying their moral character is not like Jesus. We're supposed to do that. So what is verse 20 saying? Well, the key word is revile. It means to belittle, to demean, to make fun of, to call names, to swear, to insult, to curse, to try to tear down in the language that we use about someone. Let's go, Brandon, which was code for a very demeaning way to speak about then President Joe Biden, is exactly what verse 20 is commanding against. Don't do that. Don't talk about people that way. Even in code, don't use swear words in connection with people who are in positions of power and leadership. Let me give you another example. Pope Francis died this week. There are many things that Pope Francis said and did that I didn't agree with. There are also many ways in which I thought Pope Francis was a great example of Christ-like humility and gentleness in his interactions. What you'll hear this week when you hear about Pope Francis is all of the good things about Pope Francis. But I went back and looked at some of the things that people have said about Pope Francis before he died. And one of the first things I found was an article from 2017 in The Guardian. Here's the quote from the article. It's a little bit confusing because the person who's speaking at first is the writer, the journalist. This is what the journalist says. He says, "This summer, one prominent English priest said to me," and this is the priest now speaking, "We can't wait for him to die. It's unprintable what we say in private. Whenever two priests meet, they talk about how awful Bergoglio is," that's the Pope's given name. "He's like Caligula. If he had a horse, he'd make him cardinal." Of course, after 10 minutes of fluent complaint, he added, "You mustn't print any of this or I'll be sacked." I think the priest probably should have worried less about losing his job and more about the fact that Ecclesiastes 10 verse 20 says, don't speak that way about people in leadership. That's reviling. It's to speak in an insulting sort of way. Now, to be honest, I probably could have given you hundreds of thousands of examples that would show us doing this. But instead this morning, let me show you a couple of counterexamples that are so striking because we do this so much. Consider, for example, the case of Moses with Pharaoh. Moses is a prophet of the Lord, and Pharaoh is one of the worst leaders in human history. His hard-heartedness and his childlike immaturity basically destroyed the Egyptian empire that he was reigning over because he picked a fight with God and was too stubborn to give up. He has enslaved hundreds of thousands of Israelites, children of God, and treated them brutally and oppressively. But think about it for a moment, and if you have chance later today, go back and read the stories. What names does Moses call Pharaoh, either to his face or behind his back? How does he insult him or demean him or belittle him? What sort of disparaging language does Moses use? You can go back and read the accounts. There's no quotes I can put up here of Moses doing that because there's no record of him doing such things. He did not approve of what Pharaoh was doing. He did not approve of Pharaoh's hard-heartedness. But at no point did Moses begin to revile him or demean him or belittle him. He didn't come up with swear words to use with Pharaoh's name or little catchphrases to get all of the Israelites chanting about Pharaoh. Moses does none of those things. Or consider the example of David under the rule of Saul. Saul has been rejected by God for being a disobedient, bad king. David is on the run from Saul, who is trying to kill him. What names does David call Saul? What does he say about him? What sort of disparaging words? Do you know that every time David refers to Saul, you know how he refers to him? The Lord's anointed. That's what he talks about, the man who's trying to kill him. David has two opportunities to take revenge on Saul, and he doesn't do it. In fact, he calls him the Lord's anointed. Who am I to touch the Lord's anointed? Even after Saul dies, David writes his eulogy. Or consider Daniel with Belshazzar. Of all the kings Daniel served, none of them Christians, of all the kings Daniel served, none was worse than Belshazzar. In fact, he's so bad that God himself has a hand show up, miraculously inscribe in the wall that Belshazzar has been weighed and found wanting. He's of low moral character. He's made terrible decisions. He's a bad leader. But go and read Daniel's interactions with him. There's no demeaning language. There's no belittling. There's no chanting bad things about his name. There's no swear words. There's no cursing. There's no making fun of him. There's no insults. He just simply interacts with him in a way that is fitting for Ecclesiastes 10, verse 20. Or what about Jesus under the rule of Pilate? Could there be a worse sin or abuse of leadership than for a human governor to convict wrongly the God of the universe when he knows for a fact that Jesus is innocent? He even says it. He's acknowledged that Jesus, and the only reason he crucifies Jesus is to try to please people. This is the most childlike thing you can do. But what names does Jesus call him? How does he belittle him, demean him, revile him? He doesn't. Now, I have one more example, and this one is actually an example of a hero, a great Christian who falls afoul of this, just to see how easy it is for all of us to fall into it. It comes in the book of Acts, chapter 23. Paul is on trial before the Sanhedrin, which is kind of the rulers of the Jewish people. Paul looked straight at the Sanhedrin and said, "My brothers, I have fulfilled my duty to God in all good conscience to this day." At this, the high priest Ananias ordered those standing near Paul to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, "God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. You sit there to judge me according to the law, yet you yourself violate the law by commanding that I be struck." Those who were standing near Paul said, "How dare you insult God's high priest?" Paul replied, "Brothers, I did not realize he was the high priest. For it is written, 'Do not speak evil about the ruler of your people.'" This is one of the few times we see Paul apologizing for something, and it is the very thing that we're talking about this morning. Now we have to be very careful. What is it that Paul did that was wrong? It was not acknowledging that he shouldn't have been struck. That's fair. He shouldn't have been hit. It's fair to acknowledge that. What is the thing he does wrong? Calls him a whitewashed wall. Immediately after he says it, they all recognize, no, you just spoke evil of the ruler of your people. Like, they all recognize the sin. And the minute it's pointed out to Paul that this was the high priest, he too recognizes you can't call people names. God has expressly commanded we not do that. And so Paul apologizes. Now you might be thinking, yeah, but doesn't Jesus call people like a brood of vipers? And doesn't he call people hypocrites? Actually, if you go back and look very carefully in the Gospels, You will never find Jesus calling an individual a viper or a hypocrite. He does speak about classes of people. He will talk about the Pharisees being hypocritical or being hypocrites. He will talk about those who are wicked as being a brood of vipers, but he is speaking about the general class of people. There is no individual where Jesus is having a conversation with that person or about that person that he insults them or demeans them or speaks evil against them. I didn't mention this in the first service. I was waiting to see if anyone would bring this up, and someone finally did in between the services. What about when Jesus calls Herod a fox? Fox is not an insult in the sense of Jesus is just simply acknowledging that Herod is a wily operator. He's crafty. But he does not call him names. He does not demean him. He does not belittle him. He does not swear against him. He does not insult him. It's a little like the difference between if I were to say to you, most politicians twist the truth to suit their purposes. That's very different than me saying, President Trump is a sleazy liar. Do you feel the difference in the two statements? One is okay to say. The other is absolutely forbidden by God. Do not speak of the ruler of your people in this way. Now, why? Why does this matter? Why is this important? Of all the things that we say, why should God care about this? Two reasons, I think. One, I gave us two very specific examples of this happening. One was about Let's Go Brandon in connection with then President Joe Biden, and the other was about Pope Francis. Now, my guess is that for those of us in this room, we were much more likely to have sinned against God by saying, let's go, Brandon, than we were to have made disparaging, hurtful statements about Pope Francis. Why? Well, most of us don't really think that what Pope Francis does affects us all that much. We're not Catholics. What he does, that's kind of his own business. But for President Biden, we think, no, the choices he makes affects us. And so we're much more likely to engage in reviling language about President Biden or about President Trump or about others who are in positions of influence where it affects us. But the point is, why do we get so angry? Well, with Pope Francis, we don't get very angry because we don't think what he does matters to us. With the President of the United States, we get upset because we think what he does is going to affect us. But all this is showing is the idolatry in our hearts. We actually think that the President of the United States is the one who's in control of how our lives are going to go. It's idolatry. We say these things, we get angry, we revile, we make names because we think that's the person in control, when in reality, Jesus is the one who decides how things go. You don't have to call anybody names. You don't have to insult people, because ultimately at the end of the day, that person is not in control of your life. Jesus is. And you can be like, okay, I don't agree with what the president is doing, or I don't agree with the moral character that I'm seeing displayed, but the anger, the reviling, the disparaging, the despising, that's just a sign of idolatry. That we think that person has more power than they actually have. There's a second reason why this matters. In James chapter 3, James is talking about how we speak about others. With the tongue we praise our Lord and Father, and with it we curse human beings who have been made in God's likeness. Out of the same mouth comes praise and cursing. My brothers and sisters, this should not be. Last week we talked about the fact that our God is compassionate. When he introduces himself, he is the Lord, the gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger, abounding in love. This is how God feels about people. He is full of blessing and grace and compassion and mercy. Which means that when we demean, belittle, call names, swear, insult, It is not God speaking through us. God does not talk like that. That's Satan. And the tragedy is that some of the leaders that we're trying not to revile, they themselves are setting the example for us of demeaning, belittling, name-calling, swearing, insulting, cursing. But the call to us as Christians is don't follow their example, follow the example of Jesus. Whenever you hear someone belittling, demeaning, calling names, insulting, just know it's Satan that is speaking and not Jesus. And the reason why this is so important, in a world that is filled with satanic talk about leaders, God needs someone to speak for Jesus. God needs someone to speak words that are honest. We discern poor moral character. We discern bad decision. Jesus would not like that decision. But we still speak for Jesus and like Jesus by choosing not to curse, but to bless. Hatred never overcomes hatred. Love overcomes hatred. That's why this actually matters. That's why this is important. So what do we do with this? Well, I think if we're honest, some of us in this room owe Jesus an apology. Some of us have written some stuff online. Some of us have said things to family members, to small group people. Some of us have engaged in doing this very thing that God himself commanded us not to do. We should be like Paul. When we realize it, we should confess it. You may think, it's not that big a deal. It was a big deal to Paul. It's a big deal to God. We should acknowledge it and say that we're sorry. We should also make amends. How do you do that? Not by writing letters to the people you insulted. God gives us a way to make amends. It's 1 Timothy 2. I urge then, first of all, that petitions, prayers, intercession, and thanksgiving be made for all people, for kings and all those in authority. Wait, God doesn't mean like really bad people, does he? He doesn't mean bad leaders, does he? He just means the good ones, right? He just means the ones we voted for, right? He means the ones that we agree with, right? He doesn't mean Democrats and Republicans, does he? He doesn't mean like all of the Supreme Court justices, just the ones that we like, right? For all those in authority. Wait. Giving thanks for all those in authority? That can't be right. That must be a misprint. It is not. How do we make amends for the hateful, demeaning, belittling things that we've said? We get to pray. We get to pray for both houses, both parties. We get to pray for people in Congress and in the Senate. We get to pray for governors that we may not love or mayors that we don't agree with or don't even know. We get to pray for all those in authority. Why? So that we may live peaceful and quiet lives in all godliness and holiness. This is good and pleases God our Savior, who wants all people to be saved and come to a knowledge of the truth. Do you understand what this is saying? That while we've been spending our times belittling and demeaning and swearing and calling names and making fun of people in authority, guess what hasn't been happening? Prayer. And guess what happens when there's no prayer? Nobody gets saved. Do you understand why this is important? Jesus is saying, when you do what I ask you to do, Satan wants you to make fun of them, demean them, belittle them, call them names, come up with all sorts of cute ways to tear them down and insult them, when what I asked you to do is pray for them. And when you pray for them, then I can use them, even in their wickedness and their immaturity and their evil, then I can use them to do something good, to save people. So what we're going to do is we're just going to take a few minutes right here at the end of the sermon, and just in the quiet of your heart, this is between you and Jesus. You know the things you may have said or not said. You know the ways in which it probably crossed a line, whether it was name-calling, reviling, insulting, even in your thoughts. We have a chance just to say between us and Jesus the same thing Paul said. Brothers, I'm sorry, I didn't realize what I was doing. Lord, I shouldn't have done that.